What's better, the Super Game Boy or a really bad haircut? Like, took too much off of the damn top. All right, let's be a little kinder to the Game Boy player's appearance here. Fun fact, I use quarters to screw in the Game Boy player to my GameCube. Everybody has their secrets, and you just heard mine. Yeah, my only secret. Please don't tell anybody this is all I have. Boom, there it is, the Game Boy player. I can't do this. There we go, this is much better. The Game Boy player startup disc. I want to compare these two because they're very, very comparable. They are Game Boy adapters for home consoles. The Super Game Boy was released for the Super Nintendo back in the 90s, and the Game Boy player is an accessory released for the GameCube in the 2000s. Both of these set out to do pretty much the exact same thing, but they do them in very different ways, and I think they're very interesting. Some of the coolest things you could pick up for their respective consoles. I mean, the Game Boy player, this was my very first GameCube thing I owned. I got the GameCube for my birthday, and right alongside it was a Game Boy player. I'm sure my mom went to like Toys R Us or whatever and bought a GameCube for me, and the salesperson there was like, well, does your son have a Game Boy? Well, if you pick up the Game Boy player, he can play all of his Game Boy games on the GameCube. Of course, in my opinion, that was an incredibly smart get. But at the same time, you know, for my brand new home console, the very first like modern home console that I owned, you know, prior to that, all I had was my Game Boy Advance and a hand-me-down Sega Genesis. So this was the very first brand new home console of mine, and the only thing I could do on it was play Mario Kart Super Circuit. Still was very cool. Like, I think the Game Boy player is pretty much the go-to must-have accessory for the GameCube. And the same can be said for the Super Game Boy, though I'd say the Super Game Boy is more of like an actual game that released for the Super Nintendo. It's like a game/accessory. Well, the Game Boy player is nothing but accessory. Take a look at this, they released a whole player's guide for the Super Game Boy. What the hell is this gonna be about? It's pretty much just like showing what these Game Boy games can do and look like on a Super Nintendo. One of the biggest features is the fact that the Super Game Boy kind of could display a lot of Game Boy games with actual colors. Now, a lot of these colors were more so like different palettes you could use. You know, it wasn't like, oh my god, finally Metroid 2 is fully in color. Rather, you can kind of mess around with the palettes to pick some palettes that kind of work with the game you're looking to do. However, there are some games that are kind of designed with the Super Game Boy in mind, and thus have a lot more color and some extra features to them. Most notably, we got Donkey Kong 94 right here. Not only do you get more colors featured in the actual gameplay, but you get a very unique border surrounding it that's inspired by the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. And on top of that, the actual gameplay, there are some enhancements. For example, Pauline in the game actually yells in the game in comparison to the Game Boy version where the screams of hers are more so just high-pitched beeps. This is such an elaborate little piece of software slash hardware. Just the fact, did you know you can use the Super Nintendo mouse with it? It's because there's this whole user interface with it. You can change the color palettes of the games. You can make your own border for the game and draw whatever you want. And while it has preset color palettes, you can actually design your very own color palettes. You can change the button layout to whatever you want, and you get a bunch of fancy borders. The default one is just the Game Boy screen right there, but you have a bunch of other ones. There is one that looks like you're playing in a movie theater. There's like a bunch of cats. This player's guide does a cool thing here. It actually suggests certain color palettes, kind of going like, hey, you know, this is probably gonna work the best for something like Mario Land 2 here. And then you can save certain color palettes with a password feature. That's really smart. I love that this thing actually comes up with like games to play via the Super Game Boy. They have it so then like, oh, you're playing Tetris? Well, actually, why don't you draw over the screen here so then it turns it into like a hard mode. Or how you can take certain notes with Link's Awakening. It's almost like the Super Game Boy has like some Mario Paint energy in it with how you can draw your own border and whatnot. And the fact that you can do that, it's such a minor little feature that like how many people are actually going to use it these days. But this player's guide it does show how much this opens the possibilities of the Super Game Boy having like an infinite amount of options and features. And as we can see here, they're fully showcasing how Donkey Kong 94 is pretty much the first game right here to take full advantage of the Super Game Boy. It's still a Game Boy game at the end of the day, but playing it on a Super Game Boy, you do get a wider selection of colors, and you get a fun little border. Most of the rest of this player's guide is just kind of going over some of the bigger Game Boy games Nintendo put out. Oh, would you look at that? They're using the European title of the Yoshi puzzle game. It was called Mario and Yoshi over there. And this isn't a European player's guide because our Super Nintendo looks like that. The Super Game Boy was an incredibly powerful just product. Something that's really cool here is that the cartridge itself pretty much contains an entire Game Boy in it. This right here is a Game Boy without the screen or buttons or speaker or any of that, which is pretty nuts. And I think it just adds so much value to the Super Nintendo, and it also adds a ton of value to your Game Boy games themselves, being able to play them on the TV. Because I'm just gonna say it does show how much higher quality a lot of Nintendo's Game Boy releases were compared to, like, I don't know, what you would find on the Sega Game Gear or Atari Lynx. Don't get me wrong, there were good games on those handhelds, but the Game Boy games you actually kind of wanted to play on the TV. Tell me, did you actually want to play Sonic Drift 2 on the TV? And more games than just Donkey Kong took advantage of the Super Game Boy. You have Space Invaders here. This version of Space Invaders was actually published by Nintendo, and when you play this on a Super Game Boy, you can actually unlock the arcade version of Space Invaders for the Super Nintendo and play it this way. Now, of course, it's nothing like crazy. It's still just Space Invaders at the end of the day, but just the fact that it gives you that option of like, hey, yo, Space Invaders on the Game Boy, when played on the Super Game Boy, you can unlock the arcade version of Space Invaders. That's just kind of neat. Which actually, in my opinion, this is like one of the first instances of like cross-buy being available. So, you know, Sony did this during the PS3 and PS Vita days. You know, here we have Sly Cooper, Thieves in Time, and right on the front, you can see cross-buy. You get a downloadable version of the Vita version for free just by buying the PS3 version. This is a lot more frequently seen on like digital storefronts. You know, you buy one version of a game and, you know, you can get it on your other devices. Well, Nintendo released a Super Nintendo version of Space Invaders, which by and large is just, you know, the arcade game. So let's be honest here. If you just bought the Game Boy version, you basically got this version included for free if you had a Super Game Boy, so that way you could play this game on the go, and then when you came home, you would pretty much be able to play the Super Nintendo version just via this cartridge. There's also Killer Instinct on the original Game Boy. This isn't nearly as, you know, one-to-one as like, oh yeah, you can just get this version and play it on the Super Game Boy, and it's basically the same as playing Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo. No, still definitely the Game Boy version of Killer Instinct, but the Super Game Boy does enable a couple of features. I think the most notable one for being a Game Boy game is the fact that multiplayer was enabled, so you can play this game with two Super Nintendo controllers when hooked up to the Super Game Boy, which is really cool. I mean, like, as a kid, I think I would have assumed that would work, but, you know, keep in mind, you know, these Game Boy games are designed to be linked up with different Game Boys. You know, being able to play this game multiplayer with two controllers is pretty damn cool. That's a big deal. I think what I love the most about the Super Game Boy is that it's so fun to just mess around with. Like I said, it does have that Mario Paint type energy, but I think there's more of a function to the Super Game Boy, you know, because like you're playing actual Game Boy games. This was like one of the best purchases you could probably make for the Super Nintendo. It just unlocked so much potential for that console, being able to play the entire Game Boy library. Well, you know, not the entire Game Boy library, actually. Yeah, Game Boy Color games do not work. They'll fit in there, but much like a regular Game Boy system, if you put a Game Boy Color game into a regular Game Boy system, you're just going to get an error message. I guess, you know, some Game Boy Color games, in quotes, work. Mega Man Extreme here is one of those cross-compatible Game Boy Color games. When you have like the black cartridge here that looks identical to an original Game Boy cartridge, it's just black. You know, you play it on a Game Boy Color and, you know, you get full color, but you can also play it on an original Game Boy system. It's just going to be black and white. I have no idea how anybody was able to follow that back in the 90s. You know, you talk about how dumb consumers are today. People are talking about like, oh man, what if people are confused what the Nintendo Switch 2 is? Like, try explaining this to a grandma. But these will work on the Super Game Boy. However, they're not going to have the Game Boy Color enhancements. You can mess around with the color of these in the Super Game Boy, but you're not going to get like the automatic color that you'd get on a Game Boy Color via the Super Game Boy. Keep in mind, the Super Game Boy is by all intents and purposes an original Game Boy, just without the screen. The screen is now attached to your TV and connected to your Super Nintendo. But, thankfully, Nintendo understood the assignment. Bam! It's the Super Game Boy 2. This released really late in the game, like 1998. And as we can see here, it's connecting to a Game Boy Color, which doesn't mean a goddamn thing. Okay, so the Super Game Boy 2 is not compatible with Game Boy Color games. Why does it exist? You see this little thing? This was pretty much released to give the Super Game Boy 2 link cable support, so then you can connect another Game Boy, or hell, you could connect a Super Game Boy 2 to another Super Game Boy 2. As long as that Super Game Boy 2 is also connected to a Super Famicom, which is powered on and connected to a TV, you could do that. This released during kind of the big burst of the Pokemon craze. So, yeah, I'm sure they just kind of wanted to enable that support, since the link cable was kind of crucial to Pokemon at the time. So they wanted to make sure you could, in fact, trade your Pokemon with a Super Game Boy. But, I mean, other than that, like, what the hell, man? I get why they're showing off the Game Boy Color here, because that was the current Game Boy, and it is compatible with the Super Game Boy too. In fact, I would say most games released for the Game Boy Color at the time were also cross-compatible with the original Game Boy. They were those black cartridges. So, sure, whatever, still lame and dumb as hell. This Super Game Boy does have a couple of new little borders and whatnot, and it says Super Game Boy 2 upon startup. That's it. Other than that, I mean, like, you know, I mean, you could just get this if you really want to play with the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy 2 is the definitive version, I guess, so you can do that. Of course, it was only released for the Super Famicom in Japan. However, most clone consoles these days are cross-compatible with Super Nintendo and Super Famicom and Super Nintendo European cartridges. So, you know, you could probably make do. So, I mean, yeah, you know, I use a Super Retro Trio to play a lot of my Super Nintendo games just cause it's easier. And this just plugs right into the Super Nintendo slot. So, you know, I mean, technically, yeah, this could just be my go-to Super Game Boy from here on out. The Super Game Boy is definitely more of a novelty at this point, especially compared to its follow-up, the Game Boy Player for the GameCube, with a link cable port intact right there, so then we don't have to have any Game Boy Player 2 bullshit nonsense. Definitely went for a bit of a different setup here. I mean, you kind of have to, considering the GameCube is a disc-based console, so this has to be kind of a hardware extension that you just pop on the bottom of the GameCube here, and it makes sense, you know. I feel like a GameCube with a Game Boy Player on the bottom feels the most complete to me. But of course, because of that, it isn't as immediately plug and play as the Super Game Boy was. For starters, we need the startup disc. So, you know, we have to have this to get anything out of the Game Boy Player. Which I think that's kind of the biggest flaw with this, which is not even a flaw, but more so like if you're looking to pick up a Game Boy Player today, you know, it might be easy to find the Game Boy Player attachment, but the disc is where you're gonna run into problems. I find it interesting that the Game Boy Player disc actually came in a case like this in North America, where, yeah, these are Japanese GameCube cases. Sort of a cute little tidbit. The Game Boy Player disc should come with a little outer sleeve that I don't have. That's actually kind of like something that's been a part of my childhood for a while. I don't remember having the outer sleeve as a kid. I definitely just threw it away. So when I actually rebought a Game Boy Player, like, oh god, it must be like 10 years ago or so at this point. But yeah, I specifically got one that did not come with an outer sleeve to maintain with tradition. You know, these Game Boy adapters actually skipped a generation, but not really, because the Nintendo 64 had some options available. Yes, on Nintendo 64, we had the N64 transfer pack. It was included in Pokemon Stadium here. Pretty much you'd plug this into an N64 controller, and boom! You can actually play the Pokemon games on the big screen in Pokemon Stadium. And, I think the Pokemon games are the only Game Boy games you can play on Nintendo 64. The transfer pack had a lot of other functionality, like with Mario Tennis and Mario Golf, you could connect the Game Boy Color games to the transfer pack and unlock some characters and whatnot in the N64 games. But that's all you could do. You couldn't play, like, you know, Mario Tennis or Mario Golf Game Boy Color on the N64 via that method. This was kind of just like an extra little feature of Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2. But there was something that was never released to the public for the N64. It was called the Wide Boy 64. And this was something that I believe Intelligent Systems developed for Nintendo to use at more promotional events. You know, it was pretty much an N64 cartridge, much like the Super Game Boy, where you could then plug Game Boy games into that. So then at like trade shows, promotional events, Nintendo could display and promote Game Boy games on a TV that way. And Game Boy Color games were supported. So there you go. You finally got your Game Boy Color player. Definitely would have been really cool to see that actually released for the public. Not really sure why they opted not to do that. It seems like it would have been fine. It's the same thing as a Super Game Boy for the N64. What gives? But I guess we just had to wait until the GameCube generation with the Game Boy Player. And you know what? It's fine that we did, because the Game Boy Player is kind of the ultimate official way to play Game Boy cartridges on your TV. This thing supports Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. You pop them into the bottom just like that. And you know what? As a kid, I never realized there was an eject button on the side. Check this out. This could be dangerous. Yikes. I just ripped this bastard out every time. Much like the Super Game Boy, the Game Boy Player also has a ton of different borders and options. However, it's definitely not as whimsical. I think that's my biggest problem with this device. Dicking around with the Game Boy Player is not nearly as fun as it is with the Super Game Boy. And that's a damn shame, considering this plays all the Game Boy games. Like, no, like the Super Game Boy is still the best when it comes to messing around, having a good time with the device itself. The Game Boy Player has a ton of features, but honestly, I think a lot of them are just pointless. There's a timer feature. Who cares? Why do I need a timer? I feel like they just kind of included it because they're like, well, we can. And there's a ton of different borders, but they aren't as interesting as the Super Game Boy borders. A lot of these kind of just feel like, I don't know, decals you'd put on a Game Boy Advance. You can increase the screen size, and you can change like the filter if, you know, you want it to be crisper or a little smoother. But either way, I mean, the games don't look the greatest on a Game Boy Player. They look fine, and I think a lot of this definitely has to do with modern technology. You know, I have an analog pocket, and I play a lot of my Game Boy cartridges that way on a TV. You know, you can just dock that and plug it into a TV, and my God, sometimes that thing is the most infuriating thing of all time. Sometimes it just won't connect properly to the HDMI dock. Sometimes, like, I connect a Nintendo Switch Pro controller to it to play, and for some reason, it takes forever to connect, or it disconnects, or whatever. It can be the most infuriating thing of all time, but I'm willing to put up with it because the games look fucking awesome. Like, they look a million times better than even, like, Nintendo Switch Online, which, you know, that's all emulation, but, you know, still, I mean, like, it looks, they look so damn good, and I would so much rather put up with all that crap than to play it on the Game Boy Player, where the games look fine, but there's definitely a little filter on the games that just kind of make them a little blurrier. And in addition, the old school Game Boy games, you don't have the extra options that the Super Game Boy does. You don't have the color palette options. Now, you have the color palette options that you have with original Game Boy games, playing them on a Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance. When you're starting up an original Game Boy game on a Color or Advance system, you can do some button combinations to choose which color palette you'd want the game to run in. So, you know, you have those options on Game Boy Player, but that's just not the same as the Super Game Boy, which lays out all your options via the user interface. And you know what's really, really lame? You can't change the button layouts. You can change like some, which just comes down to like where the L and R or select and start buttons are, but you can't change where the B and A buttons are or anything like that. And I think that's lame as hell. The GameCube controller, I love that thing. I love it to death. It is not ideal for a lot of 2D games, a lot of the games you'd be playing on the Game Boy, which that also includes the fact that the GameCube's D-pad is way too small. For the most part, you can make do with it, or you can just rough it out, use the analog stick, who cares? But yeah, the GameCube controller is not the ideal controller for a lot of these Game Boy games. Thankfully, there was an officially licensed controller released by Hori that's GameCube branded, that has all the GameCube buttons and all of that, but the D-pad is the main focus here. It's much bigger, and it's shaped like a Super Nintendo controller. But again, like, the button layout is still that funky ass GameCube one. I love the GameCube button layout, but you know, like, I kind of wish like I could kind of change some things up with the Game Boy Player in the options. But you know what the most egregious thing about this is? Won't work. Game Boy Advance video cartridges don't work on the Game Boy Player. Obviously, they did this because, hey, as a kid, I thought like, well, damn, I have a Game Boy Advance video cartridge. I could just plug that into my GameCube and then record a VHS tape of this, and then I have a VHS copy of my Game Boy video cartridge. If they stopped you from doing that because of that, I think that's kind of dumb, considering like, yeah, you can do that with like literally anything. If I have a VHS tape of Shark Tale, I could plug that into a VCR and then record it onto another VHS tape on another VCR. It was very easy to do that. Everybody knew how to do that. So the fact they were like, oh no, we can't have people creating bootleg copies of these videos, it's just, I don't know. I think it's kind of silly, especially because at the very beginning, when you play a Game Boy Advance video cartridge, every single one of them have a splash screen that plays ahead of time that says not compatible with Game Boy Player. They damn well want to make sure you know, don't even try that, bitch. However, the Game Boy Player does offer a couple of neat little things that, you know, we hadn't really seen up to this point. For example, some Game Boy Advance games actually are programmed with the Game Boy Player in mind. Now, what does that mean? Not much, but something that can happen. Let's say you're playing Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3 on the Game Boy Player. That game actually has rumble support. So playing with the GameCube controller, it rumbles. Now, I don't really think it's worth a game like Mario Advance 4 having the Game Boy Player logo at the startup of the game. Like, whenever you turn on Mario Advance 4, it says Game Boy Player. I don't know why. Like, yeah, it enables rumble support when played on here, but why is that on the splash screen? It's not a big deal, bro. Mario vs. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy Advance also has like a specific Game Boy Player mode in the options, which just kind of just like changes the colors a little bit. Like, it barely does a damn thing. Like, I did some research and like most people were confused beyond belief. I saw a message board in 2004, people like, what the fuck is this mode? And then everybody was like, I don't know, it's not changing anything. Like, I guess the mode is to kind of like just take advantage of the fact you're playing on a TV screen. I don't know. It could have been like a cute little nod to the fact that Donkey Kong 94 had a bunch of Super Game Boy features. So then Mario vs. Donkey Kong, its spiritual successor, is like, well, we can do that too. And it didn't do a damn thing. Well, folks, that is the Super Game Boy versus the Game Boy Player. What do I like more? Oh, God, I don't know. I mean, the Super Game Boy is easier to fall in love with, but the Game Boy Player functionally goes a lot farther. You can do a lot more with it just based on the fact that Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games are supported. As tactile and nice as it is to just plug a Game Boy game into the Super Game Boy and just plug it into the Super Nintendo. The Game Boy player, I think it was kind of hyperbolized how annoying that is, because like realistically, you plug it into the bottom of the GameCube and you're good to go after that. Just put the disc in and then pop your Game Boy game in and you're set. Hell, you can swap out games without turning the GameCube off. You just have to do it in the settings. So it is very convenient, the fact that it's always there. You just need the startup disc. But it doesn't have the same personality and it's not as fun to mess around with as the Super Game Boy. And honestly, in this day and age, there's a lot more options to play Game Boy games on your TV. Hell, like I said, even with something like the Analog Pocket, there's a bunch of clone systems out there. Stuff like the Retron 5. There's even like this Retron little cube stupid thing. I don't even think it looks that great. Regardless of the quality of some of these devices, there are a lot more options to do that kind of thing these days. Back then, this was kind of all you had. The Game Boy player was kind of the bee's knees when it came to playing Game Boy games on your TV. The Super Game Boy was kind of like its cooler father, who like wasn't doing much anymore, but he was still a lot cooler. And then his son over here was like a very successful businessman who was very productive, but did not have time in his life for love. That's your analogy today. Take it or leave it. The point is, at the end of the day, you have a lot more options when it comes to Game Boy games on your TV. A lot more than just these two. These are your official options, which is neat. But even when it comes to digital official offerings, the Wii U Virtual Console had a bunch of Game Boy Advance games. May not have had Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, but then you move over to the Nintendo Switch Online service and you have Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games, and a hearty dose of them too. In addition to a lot of Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games available via collections available, like the Castlevania Advance Collection. And honestly, my opinion is the Analog Pocket is the best option of them all if you do want to play with physical cartridges, but if you have to keep things official, I think I still have to go with the Game Boy player. As wonderful as the Super Game Boy is and how neat everything is here, the Game Boy player just does it all. But the Super Game Boy does more cool stuff outside of the user interface. You see all these Super Game Boy enhanced games. There's even more than what I just said there. Now, a lot of the options that I gave were definitely kind of like the cream of the crop when it came to what certain games did with the Super Game Boy hardware. So at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter. But I do think the Super Game Boy is cooler, though the Game Boy player is the way to go. So congratulations, Game Boy player, even though you told me to go fuck myself.